All right, so this week we're going to look at something called the Third Century Crisis, or the crisis that happened in the 200s AD. What I'll do first is talk a little bit about what's going on in the first and second centuries, and then lead that up into the third century. I've shown you this map before at the very beginning of the class with the extent of the Roman Empire, where you've got it from the borders of Scotland all the way down into North Africa, and then all the way deep into Persia, which was really a one-time deal, and then all of North Africa and Egypt. So it was a pretty large empire. Um, when you think about how these cities are set up and how the Romans actually controlled them, they did something pretty interesting in terms of what I've numbered here as number one. Cities had their own autonomy. So when the Romans came in and took over different areas, they usually allowed the government that was in control before the Romans took over to stay in power. Of course, owing their allegiance to the Romans, but it made the power transition pretty easy. Now, as these emperors become more and more powerful, it's not a big surprise that the Senate started to lose its power that it had before. And then number three here, this again isn't a surprise if you think about what the process is of the Romans taking over. If they're giving cities local autonomy, then the local elites, or the people who are running the government, become more and more powerful, and then they want to be on the Roman Senate as well. Now, we talked about the development of the consuls before, where in the Roman Republic you had two. You would still have sometimes have two in the Roman Empire, and usually the emperor would be the one consul, and then you get someone else. But usually they were sort of powerless positions, but they had a lot of prestige, so a lot of people still wanted those. In terms of the transitions, you still have some of the offices, and I know we haven't talked about a lot of these, the quaestors, the aedils, the praetors, the prefects. Um, but the government remained the same for the most part because there was a government obviously under the Roman Republic, and it was fairly successful until you have all those civil wars. But then Augustus decided to keep everything pretty much the same. Um, you get the development of police and firefighters. Certainly during the first century, when you've got a big part of Rome being burned down, and we talked about that before. And no big surprise, Rome was a capital in many different ways. So, political capital, economic capital, and so on. On these next two slides, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I do want to talk just show you a little bit about sort of production of what was happening in these areas that Rome controlled. And of course, an economy is really, in the ancient world, is really the agricultural products they can produce as well as the natural resources. And so, and I won't read through all these, but in Africa, it was considered to be the breadbasket as well as Egypt. So you've got other things like wine, and all these, as I put here, were exported to Italy. In Spain, you have a big mining industry. So a lot of metals discovered in Spain and dug out and then shipped back to Rome and Italy. And then Gaul, which is in the northern part where modern France and Germany are today, wheat, grapes, wood, and so on. So all these were shipped back to Rome. And then in the eastern side, sometimes you see the same things like grapes. The Romans were big wine drinkers. They weren't really beer drinkers like they were, say, in Egypt and the Near East. But then again, you can stop the slide and look through all the products that are being produced in these areas, and then think of these as like monetary issues where they're flowing back and forth and mostly going to Rome. Okay, so when you think about the size of the Roman Empire, there are undoubtedly enemies that the Romans had to deal with, and this is partly because as they're spreading, they're bouncing into other people. And I just give you a list here of some of the issues that the Romans were having. So in the far north, especially north of Britain, you've got the Picts, the Scots. They are all fighting against the Romans, In northern Gaul, you've got the Germani, you've got a group called the Franks and the Goths, and we'll talk about the Franks and the Goths towards the end of the course when we talk about so these barbarian invasions. Um, and so these were giving the Romans trouble on their northern border. Now on the eastern border, you've got Persia. And Persia had been a threat to the Romans for centuries, as I put here. Um, Now it was going to be a much bigger threat in the 200s with the change of dynasties and the beginning of the Sassanids and with King Ardashir and especially with King Shapur, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And then in Egypt, you had some issues with the southern civilizations that were below Egypt in terms of wanting to take over and control that area. So the Romans were really spread out in terms of their military trying to deal with all these different problems. Okay, in terms of the economy, now I've gone through the list of all the products and natural resources that are being used up by Rome. So trade was booming, and it's partly because of the roads. You also have stability on the seas in terms of, there weren't very many pirates left and so on. Sea trade was a bit iffy, especially in the winter where it was more dangerous to sail, but it was booming because of the roads. And you saw those products I just talked about. The food supply was fairly steady, and of course, when you've got a steady food supply, the people are happy. It's when they're hungry, it can be a real danger. Um, Also in 212, I should really make sure you read up a little bit about this, is that all of these places that, the map that I just showed you, people living there were not necessarily Roman citizens. So, but in 212, you've got an emperor named Caracalla, and it's sometimes called the Entente Constitution or the Edict of Caracalla, where he gives all free men in the Roman Republic citizenship. And if you think about why he was doing this, there are a number of different reasons that scholars have looked at. One was economic, because now these people can be taxed more easily because they're Roman citizens and everyone has to pay tax. Judicial, it made it a little bit easier for Roman laws to cover these people. So a couple of different issues going on here, but it was mostly a financial issue. Caracalla had to raise taxes, and this was an easy way to do it. And people were very happy to become citizens when they weren't before. Okay, so the beginning of the third century crisis really begins with an emperor named Maximinus Thrax, or just Thrax. Like a lot of emperors in the 200s, he was a foot soldier and then rose up to be emperor by being a really good tactician. So um, when he became emperor, he did a lot of things that made some people very unhappy, which was tax collecting. Tax collection is always an issue for every civilization. Everyone thinks they pay too much taxes. Thrax wanted more taxes. And so he really pushed the tax collectors to collect more. And then you start to see rebellions happening, especially in Africa. And remember, we talked about the importance of Africa in terms of agriculture. So if there's rebellions in Africa, that could stop the wheat flow to Rome, which would mean the free food, the free bread that was being handed out in Rome could be cut. People would be hungry, and then you would get a rebellion in Rome. So that had to all be put down. And then Italy started to rebel against his rule as well. And you can see he didn't rule very long, 235 to 238. Senators hated him, and then he was actually assassinated. And this brought a whole bunch of other issues. I had mentioned when I showed you that map in the east where you've got the Persians. So um, with the rise of the Sassanians, you've got um, a, a Persian king called Shapur. And what you can see on this picture, let me see if I can write on this. You've got Shapur sitting here on his horse, and I'll talk about this here. You've got two Roman emperors that are really in submission poses because Shapur causes a lot of damage to the Roman Empire during this period. One emperor in this particular rock relief is Philip, and he ruled from 244 to 249. Not very long, and this is the case for a lot of the emperors in the 200s. Philip became emperor when a big part of the Roman military was in Persia and lost a battle to King Shapur. So Philip had to negotiate with Shapur to pull the Romans out of a disastrous situation, and Philip also had to pay a large indemnity or large payment to the Persians every year to keep them from reinvading. So he didn't get a very good name because of that. Now, also in the same year that Philip became emperor, you've got the people living in the north, sometimes called barbarians. I realize that's not the best name for them, but people living in the north of the barbarians are attacking the borders. Now, I just mentioned you have a whole lot of emperors in the 200s. Decius is another one that rises up. Now, he kills Philip and his son because you didn't want the son coming in and saying, he should be emperor. Um, and Decius had to also deal with both the Persians and the barbarians, and he ended up dying in battle. Probably the worst defeat that the Romans had in this whole string of disasters in the 240s and 250s was Emperor Valerian. He had to deal with issues on all of their borders. He actually took an army into Persia and was captured by the Persians. And it's interesting that the Romans never attempted to rescue him. They just left him there and he died in captivity. And there's an interesting text that talks about how Shapur ended up stuffing Valerian and using him as a footstool to show total domination of the Romans. So what's going on here? Why is all this sort of falling apart during the 200s? One, of course, is that there's too much fighting. You've got issues happening all around the Roman Empire. You also have the military taking control. So in the past, you do have this, emperors rising up, being chosen by the military. Now, that has a very long tradition. So, but when you get to the stabilization of the Roman Empire, they tried to stop that by having the sons of the emperor become the next son. But in the 200s, this whole position weakens, and the military starts raising up people. And of course, you can have the military in Britain raise up an emperor, and then the military in Egypt raise another emperor, and then it's almost just like the story retold of the Roman Republic, where you've got a number of civil wars. So you also had an economic crisis because when these people are all coming in from all these different directions, cities are looted, trade gets disrupted, and so on. Now, what the Romans ended up doing is sort of printing more money, and they had to make money cheaply because they didn't have the wealth to really keep up with the money that they really needed. So they did something called debasement, where the coins are devalued. So a good example is, you've got a silver dollar. You expect there to be $1 worth of silver in that particular coin, but what the Romans ended up doing is taking a cheap metal like copper and then dipping a silver coating on it and saying, here's your silver dollar. People realized soon that it was not worth a dollar. And so what they ended up doing is inflation went through the roof, where a loaf of bread might be $1 one day, it might be $100 the next, and $1,000 and $1,000,000 in a couple of weeks. So lots of things were happening. And of course, you've got a social crisis because as you have too much fighting, you have the taxes being raised. And I think I have a slide on this next. So poor people had to pay more taxes, which dragged them down even further, and people started to rebel more and more. I mentioned this too, you've got multiple emperors during this period. So you've got 18 emperors between 235 and 284, and 24 usurpers. And a usurper is a person who comes in and wants to be emperor, but isn't in sort of the legal line of succession. So you've got someone coming in, say in Britain, popping up as being the emperor, and the other emperor is sitting in Rome. The one in Britain would be the usurper, and then they would always fight. Um, so what you really have is a military issue. So you've got attacks from the east and attacks from the north, which led to more and more taxes, which led to inflation, which led to social upheaval. Now, the person to end all of this was an emperor named Diocletian, and I've given you the years that he ruled here. He started off fairly low in the military and then rose up to be the head of the bodyguard for an emperor named Numerian. Now, Numerian was assassinated, and then Diocletian took over. Um, Diocletian did not rule from Rome. He ruled from a city called Nicomedia, which is in northwestern Turkey, and this really becomes his capital. He stays in northwestern Turkey mostly because he had to deal with the Persians still. And if you're in Rome, that's a long ways away. He also did a number of different things to help ease this crisis. So he created something called the Tetrarchy, which tetra is four, and arch, A-R-C-H, is rule. So Tetrarchy is the rule of four. So he essentially created an emperor in the west and himself in the east, and then he created a person below him. You can think of him like a vice president called a Caesar. And so you've got Diocletian in the east, and then he has a Caesar. And then in the west, you have a new emperor created, and then under him, you have a Caesar. And the idea is that when the emperor dies or something, everyone knows who's next in power. You don't get this rising up of all these different people because of the military. Now, I have to say it didn't really work, but at least calmed things down for a little bit. I mentioned he divided the empire, and he also created more provinces. He doubled the provinces to make tax collection a little bit more efficient. In one way, it worked, and another way, it actually doubled the bureaucracy, so you had more people to pay. But that's what he tried to do. Don't worry about all of this on this slide. So I just wanted to sort of break it down where he was ruling and where his Caesars were ruling. Constantius, the one person we will talk about just a little bit next week, was the emperor in the northwestern part of the Roman Empire. The reason I bring him up now is because he is the father of Constantine, called Constantine the Great, who will be the first Christian emperor. So I'll bring that back when we start talking about him. Okay, so what did Diocletian do exactly? So he made a new army. He made it smaller in one respect by making the legion smaller and more mobile, um, and put more people on the borders. So this would sort of remove the military from the center part of the Roman Empire where they weren't having too many issues and moving them up into the borders and then making it more mobile so they can move faster so you can actually have less troops. He tried to fix the economy. Remember we talked about debasement by issuing new coins with more silver, and it made people feel better, lowered inflation a little. He made new tax laws about when taxes could be collected. And one of the biggest things he did that he's remembered for is something called the Edict of Maximum Prices, or the Price Edict. And what that really said is, and this was a document, we have copies, partial copies all over the Roman Empire. But what it did was it said, for example, a loaf of bread, the maximum price for a loaf of bread could be $1. You can charge less, but you cannot charge more, or there's severe penalties. And this was issued for everything from a loaf of bread to a chariot with wheels or a chariot with a horse and so on. So this was the way they tried to control inflation, by having maximum prices. The last thing I want to mention, we've already talked about this, is Diocletian is also more famous in Christian history for starting the Great Persecution. And like I said, we've already talked about this last week, so I don't want to mention it here again. And then finally, what's really interesting is that Diocletian was pretty happy with the way his tetrarchy was working. He actually abdicated, meaning he left power in 305, and this is really rare. You usually die in office or killed in office. But he retired to his palace, and he also forced Maximian into retirement, and then that caused the two Caesars to rise up and to be the emperor. So Diocletian wanted a clean start for the next group of people. And really what this ended up doing is allowing the Roman Empire to continue until the middle end of the 4th century. So about another 100 years before the Roman Empire, at least in the West, starts to fall apart.